I'm Peter Kay from Restoration Design, and welcome to another wiring install video. Today we're going to be talking about a new product, a 914-6 complete harness, which we'll be installing in one of our cars. So here on the harness board, we have the complete 914-6 harness. As you can see, it's quite long. Prior to putting it on the board, we've drawn everything up in rapid harness, so we have it on the computer. From there on, we can print one-to-one scale our diagram, and we can overlay our wires based on our schematic. After we overlay the wires, we can take care of all our sheathing and our terminations. After that, the harness is ready to go into the car. A few important features we want to highlight on this harness. Firstly, we're using the period correct tape that was used in the era to tape up the harness in this section and towards the rear of the car. In addition, we've put on a new snorkel tube, which comes out from the tunnel towards the engine bay. And we've also applied the correct plastic sheathing. And lastly, we have on both ends, near the steering column and at the relay board in the engine bay, brand new 14 pole and 12 pole connectors. Prior to installing the harness in the car, we're going to tape up all the loose ends to the main stock of the harness. This will do two things. This will ease the installation and protect your harness from damage while pulling it through the tunnel. So when beginning the installation of the harness in the car, first thing you'll want to do is mount the fuse panel, which is located here in the driver's footwell. So fasten the fuse panel with your two 5mm bolts. And from there, the next step will be running the rear of the harness. So we've divided the harness in the car in two sections. Here's your front section, and here's our back section. So as previously mentioned, we've taped it all up to protect the harness from damage while it's coming through the tunnel and being brought out in the engine bay. For this job, we highly recommend asking a friend for assistance. So here we have the rear light portion. We're going to start feeding the harness through the tunnel with this section. Important though, when feeding the harness, do not come through the top of the tunnel, but start around the bottom side. And from there, you can feed the tunnel harness through this orifice. Here you can see as we're feeding the harness through the tunnel, our tape job, which will not remain on the finished product, but our tape job will protect the harness from these sharp edges as we go in and out to the engine bay. So here we have Aaron pulling the harness in the engine bay as I'm feeding it through under this brace. One thing you might find helpful while installing a harness, or any harness, is some lubricant. So either soap and water work great, or here we have synthetic clear wire lubricant, which can be purchased at any hardware store. I believe we purchased this product at Home Depot. So gently coat the harness, at least the portions that you're concerned about, in the lubricant, and then that should assist in feeding the wires through the tunnel. Okay. In order to feed the rest of the harness up through the tunnel and towards the top of the engine, we need to be able to get through this grommet hole. In order to do so, I've taken off the tape we applied earlier to protect the harness off this plug, which I'll feed through first. Once I have the plug through the hole, then I'll feed the remainder of the harness. What we can do is fasten that here. So as you can see here, we've gotten the majority of the harness through this grommet hole, and we're now approaching the location where the snorkel is. At this point, we're going to remove the protective covering we've put on for the installation and then snap our snorkel into the two respective holes. When installing this snorkel tube or any grommet, it's important to keep in mind that you do not want to use a screwdriver. It's common practice for people to use a flathead screwdriver, but you run the risk of puncturing your grommet or your snorkel tube, including the sheathing of the wiring or the wiring itself. A quick tip for that is to use the wiring lubricant or some simple soap and water to ease the installation. At this point in the installation, we've got both sides of the snorkel installed appropriately. We're going to tee the harness off to the passenger side where the fuel pump and the battery tray is located. And on the other side, we're going to feed our relay board with the harness, our rear lights, and the engine bay light as well. So another thing to keep in mind when installing this harness, your fuel pump connection, most importantly your connector housing, will not be on the two terminations. In order to install the harness from the tunnel back, this will have to be removed or not present during the installation. Once the harness has been placed into the engine bay, then you can put your plug onto the two wires. We have two wires here. One is a black-red and the other a brown. If we have our indicating mark on the plug at the top, our black-red wire is going to the left side. So front of the connector with our indicator at the top, our black-red wire is going to the left. Important feature to keep in mind when installing these beads into the connector is that our tab is located correctly with that recess. So our tab is here, and we're going to slide it into the connector and snap it in. Black, red, brown wire with the tabs facing inwards. From the tee off of our snorkel, our harness follows this panel to the corner where it tees off again. Here we have our 14 pin connector that's clipped into the relay board, and importantly, a grounding point. From that point on, we're going to run our rear accessory lights and our engine bay light. Coming from our relay panel, we've followed our retaining tabs up the fender well towards this recess located within the trunk lid seal. After that, we're going to follow our retaining tabs along the edge of the fender to where our light terminations are. Even further, we have our terminations for our license plate lights, and finally finishing off with the passenger side rear light. So far we've installed the tunnel portion of the car, the engine bay, and the rear lights. Following this, we're going to move on to the front of the harness. So I've separated the harness into two remaining sections. We've got our dashboard section here. I've thrown it over the steering column so it's out of the way. And I've got our front section here. This section, in its entirety, it gets fed through this small grommet hole in front of the fuse panel. Now that we've fed the wire up through the grommet in the firewall, we're going to make our way across the dashboard on the front end with the wiper wire, our fuel gauge sender wires, and our blower motor. So again, like on the previous sections of the car, we'll use the retaining tabs to fasten down the harness against the chassis of the car. Continuing past this branch where we have our blower motor and fuel gauge wires, we'll move down the main trunk where it splits off into two sections here. This small 2-wire section goes through the car, through a grommet, and towards your master cylinder. And then we can run the remainder of the trunk along these retaining tabs to your grommet hole here and fasten the harness with this grommet. As your bundle gets thicker coming through the grommet hole, what you may want to do is push down the harness here to provide yourself more room to push the wires through. After proper placement of the grommet, our main trunk of the harness in the front section will follow the contour of the vehicle, and we're going to place the entire main trunk using our retaining tabs. After we have the main trunk placed in the front section, then we can run our horn, fog light, headlight, and signal wires, including the power wires required for the motors of the headlights. So as you can see, we have our horn wire and our fog light wire coming through the front of the car. Now that we have the wires through, we're going to be installing our grommet using this handy tool we have on our website. And this tool allows for the expansion of the grommet over your cables. Now we've wrapped our harness up and around the bottom of the headlight motor, and we're going to divide the remainder of our harness into 3 sections. We've got our wires that drive our headlight motor, these 3 here. Then we've got our 3 wires that feed power to our headlight, which will go through this grommet hole right here. And then lastly, we have this bundle of wires that's going to go through the fender into our fender grommet and feed power to our signal lights. The last thing I'm going to do here is hook up my signal wires, and that requires us to go through the fender. So there's a little grommet hole that we can feed the rest of our wires through. In order to run the side marker lights through this grommet, we're going to use some simple tools here. I've taken a bit of welding rod and I've ground off the end so it's not sharp. And I have some non-adhesive vinyl tape, which we will fasten our harness to this welding rod and feed it through the grommet. Now, the reason we use non-adhesive tape, it's a preference because it doesn't leave any residue behind on the harness, but regular electrical tape will be just fine, providing you're okay with cleaning up the adhesive. So we have our welding rod coming through our side marker boot, and we're just gonna put some of this wire lubricant on the harness to ease the installation. Just like that. Now we're gonna have to remove this tape that we've placed on here and put the welding rod on the 2 wires for the far light that run through this hole here at the end. Now to feed these longer wires, as mentioned before, through this hole, I'm gonna use the same welding rod and I'm gonna work backwards. And voila. Now we're ready for our last boot to cover our contacts for the signal light on the fender. Now, in order to finish the install of our wiring harness for our signal lights, we're going to install this square boot over the remaining 2 contacts. So we're gently going to feed this through over the welding cable, bring it down over the sheathing, and then we can unwrap our tape, expose our contacts, and hook our wires up. Now I have to finish off the install here with 2 last steps. I'm going to install this grommet for our headlight wires, and we're also going to put together our 2 ground contacts. 1 ground is coming from our main harness, which you have here with 3 wires, and in addition to that, we have 1 ground coming from our headlight motor. We'll be putting them right here on this stud, and as always, make sure all your grounding points are cleaned off and use some dielectric grease to maintain continuity. Beauty. There's that. And then we have to Now that we've got all our wires more or less hooked up, we want to finish off the front corner of the harness by installing our light bulb connector housing. Now obviously this doesn't come installed on the connectors, as it would be very difficult to feed through the car and through the grommets. So it's done there after the fact. And voila. We've completed the installation of the harness on the passenger side of the vehicle. Now, there are no differences between the left and the right or the driver and passenger side, so you can finish off the front install using the same procedure that was used on the passenger side of this video. For the last portion of this video, we'll be running the wiring harness for the dash. This, in my opinion, is the more daunting element of this install. We've retained the steering column for demonstration purposes, as we have the 12-pole plug, but you may want to remove the steering column prior to the install of the dash to make sure you're not going to break off your switches here. So the next step here will be loosely placing the dash tin into the car and running the wires. We've managed to place our dashboard tin into the correct recesses. Now we're going to feed our wire across the bottom of the tin against the bottom of the steering column. Now it gets a little busy in here, so you'll want to divide all your harness branches. This, for example, is for the gauges. Here we have our ignition switch, and we have our various 3 switches. So we have our hazard switch, our light switch, and a fog light switch. The last step to finishing our dash wiring will be installing our 12-pole connector. We'll have to do a little jog in the harness, 180-degree jog, so we can mate up with 12-pole connector from the steering column right here. In addition to that, we'll have wires for climate control, cigarette lighter, defrost switch, and lastly, a small wire that runs to our door switch. In order to finish off the interior of the car, we're going to run a few small wires. The first wire running from our routing point here to our heater controller stems off the main stock, brown-white wire. In addition to that, we have a small brown-white wire here as well that feeds our handbrake switch, which is located in this little square recess in the channel across the tub. Lastly, we have a set of wires here, 3 of which are going to feed our interior light, and the remaining 2 will branch off to each side and feed our rear window defroster. After this point, we more or less have the wire routing complete. To help with the installation of the harness, we used 3 tools. First was the rubber ring expander for our grommets. Secondly, some non-adhesive electrical tape as to not leave any residue behind. And lastly, some wire lubricant you can buy at Home Depot. Hey guys, I hope you've enjoyed watching us route this wiring harness through the 914-6. If you'd like to see another video of us hooking up the wires in more detail, do comment below and we'd be happy to show you. In the meantime, stay tuned for more. Thanks for watching.